So thank you for being here with us today. Today we're going to continue in the book of Judges. And we've been on the same judge for the last couple weeks. We'll finish that judge today. Anybody know who we're on? Gideon. And so Gideon, we know, is often remembered as the underdog hero, the timid man in the winepress, and the man God used to lead Israel to miraculous victory. And this is how his story is remembered, and it's celebrated as this man who was empowered by God, equipped by God to do great things. And if I'm honest, if I think about God using me, that's very attractive, right? That's the story we would go, yeah, that's how I want my story to go. But Gideon's story, though inspiring, doesn't just end there. There is another side to it. And here, before we beat Gideon up, because it'll feel like we are today, there's another story to all of our story, right? Because we're human. And so Gideon is human. But the other side of the story that isn't nearly as much talked about, but I do think is just as important for us to see, is what happens after the victory. After the Midianites are defeated, after the trumpets blast and the jars are shattered and the army flees, and after Gideon's name is known and his influence is established. It's what happens after all of that that has a lot to teach us and is a little unsettling. Because what we see is the Gideon who once asked for signs from God no longer seeks him. The Gideon who tore down idols tore down idols begins to build one that suspiciously looks like an idol. And the man who said God would rule over you slowly begins ruling in God's place. And what we see with this story is not a dramatic turn. No scandal, no big dramatic thing happened. But it was a slow fade. And so what we want to do today, and what I think really is happening as we look at Gideon's story, is this is somewhat of a spiritual autopsy, a post-mortem on his spiritual journey with God. Now look, Gideon doesn't no longer become a follower of God, but his influence and his spiritual connection and the way he's growing and depending on the Lord is dramatically changes. And so what I want us to do today is look at his story, do an autopsy of the story, not a dead body, but his spiritual life, and see what it has to teach us. Because here's the thing, though this is Gideon's story, this very quickly can become our story. After a big, difficult challenge, after we plead and beg with God, after things finally settle down, we are just as vulnerable as Gideon to fall into the same traps he did. And so what I want us to do today is take his story and begin to ask this question. What's been growing or dying inside of me? Because what you have to realize, if you don't slow down to dissect what's happening, you almost, until you get to the very last verses, you would think everything was business as usual. It looks fine. But God does a whole lot more than what just looks good, right? He inspects the heart. And so what I want us to do is, by looking at Gideon's life, use it to inspect our own heart. And to ask, Lord, what are you growing or what is dying inside of me? Because if we're not careful, we'll end up just like Gideon. And I thought about this morning, what difference would it have made in Gideon's life if he had had some moment where he was challenged to reflect before he faded away from the Lord? And so that's what I hope we'll use Gideon's mistakes as an opportunity to examine our own lives. So here's the first of this spiritual autopsy. Here's the first thing we find happens. Gideon stopped listening. See, if we look at Judges 6 and 7, Gideon's story is really about a man who is conversing and listening to the Lord. There's constant conversation with God. Doesn't mean he was always right, doesn't mean he was always faithful, but he was constantly talking to God. If you look at Judges 6, 12 through 16, the Lord personally calls him. Judges 6, 17 through 21, Gideon asks for a sign. 6, 36 through 40, he lays out the fleece not once but twice. And again, was that a lack of faith? Sure. But was it taking his lack of faith and going to the Lord? Yes. He took his doubts to God. And then we see in 7, 9 through 15, God sends him into the enemy camp to overhear a dream to strengthen his courage. So 6 and 7 are continually, we see this consistent theme of a conversation with the Lord. See, Gideon was unsure, fearful, and dependent. But his dependence made him deeply attentive to God. He wasn't strong, but he was listening. But then we go to Judges 8 and we see a change. All of a sudden, there's no prayer, there's no asking, there's no waiting, just strategy, response, and movement. And it's subtle, but it's devastating. Look at Judges 8, 1 through 3. It says, Then the men of Ephraim said to him, What is this that you have done to us? Not to call us when you went to fight against Midian. And they accused him fiercely. And he said to them, What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the grape harvest of Abiezer? God has given into your hands the princess of Midian, Oreb and Zeb. What have I been able to do in comparison with you? Then their anger against him subsided when he said this. See, Gideon responds to Ephraim without seeking God's counsel. All of a sudden, it becomes a negotiation and diplomacy. See, I want to be clear. We first see these things and they don't seem that bad. But we're going to see this continual theme. Almost every time before he moved, what does it say? God said, he asked. All of a sudden, it's instinct. And we'll see quickly, because you may go, I'm not sure that was a bad thing to do. Well, we'll see how his response is much more about how he feels than it is about what God says to do. So we see here, he flatters them. He says, oh, goodness, I couldn't do any better than you. Who am I to challenge you? And they feel better. So I am sure Gideon felt like he did a good job. And then we go to verse 4. And it says, And Gideon came to the Jordan, and he crossed over. He and 300 men who were with him, exhausted, yet pursuing. Now again, what's missing? No guidance, no word from God, no altar, no pause. Just grit. And we may go, oh, isn't that really great of him? He just put his head down and keep pushing. And yes, there are times that's exactly what we're supposed to do. But did he ever ask God what he was supposed to do? And I have learned this in my life. The minute I think I know what God wants me to do and I don't need to ask him anymore is the minute I start to rely on me and not God. And this is what we see Gideon doing. He becomes the expert. a man who was terrified, a man who was so afraid he needed God to reveal a dream to him just to get him to go do what he had to do, and now he's making all the decisions on his own. And see, this is the difficult part about this passage. He's still doing something that looks godly, pursuing the enemy, but without God's voice shaping his path. As I was preparing, I saw this story about an airplane in 1979 and that crashed. And it says in 1979, Air New Zealand, Flight 901 was scheduled for a scenic sightseeing trip over Antarctica. It was supposed to just be a routine flight, one the pilot had made multiple times. The weather was clear, and the plane was in perfect order. The passengers were excited. There was no warnings, no alarms, no visible danger. But shortly after departure, the plane crashed into the side of a mountain, killing all 257 people on board. What happened? Investigators later discovered that the flight's navigation coordinates had been changed by just 2 degrees. Not enough to be noticed, not enough to sound alarms, but it put the aircraft at 28 miles east of where the pilots believed they were going, right in the path of an invisible mountain cloaked in whiteout conditions. What made it worse, the pilot didn't know the coordinates had been changed. They trusted their instruments, they were confident, they were calm, but they were flying blind. And this is what happens to Gideon. See, when we meet him in Judges 6, he's timid and unsure. So what does he do? He waits on God. But by Judges 8, he's flying high. He's on this mission. He's pushing forward, but without checking his coordinates. There's no more praying. There's no more altars. No more listening. Just moving. And he didn't realize he was off course. And that's what it looks like to drift spiritually. You're still doing good work. You're still doing things that could not be considered a sin. Everything looks fine. But you stop checking in with God. You stop listening to God. You stop asking God, are we on the right direction? And all of a sudden, you end up like Gideon. You stop listening, and you end up off course. And it's important to remember, and I've said this a couple times, but what Gideon does here in Judges 8, 1 through 4 is not this gross, awful sin. It's this simple shift from waiting and depending and listening to going, moving, and doing. And before he knows it, he ends up farther and farther from God. See, Paul David Tripp says this. He says, when God is no longer necessary for the work of your ministry and life, stop. You're building something that may have his name, but not his presence. And I stumbled on another quote that's not on the screen, but I'll read it to you. And it says, busyness is not a spiritual gift. Activity without listening is just noise. And if we're not careful, we'll get so confident in what we're doing, and we'll get so confident in what it provides us that we'll stop waiting and listening to the Lord. And we'll go, but I'm doing it what's right. Why does it feel so off? Why am I so tired? Why is it taking so much of me? And maybe it's because we're like Gideon. We're exhausted, but we just keep pushing and never say, hey, God, how are we doing? Where are we? So what do we do about this? How do we fix this? How do we keep this from happening in our life? I have a few things, and we'll move to the next point. So how to deal with this? First, do an audit. What voices are shaping your decisions right now? When was the last time you truly waited on God before making a decision? And when you ask yourself that question, what voices am I listening to? Is it the voice of fear rushing you into a decision? Is it the voice of pride telling you you've got this handled? Or is it the voice of other people's expectations leading you to say yes when God hasn't spoken? You can't follow God's voice if you don't know what voices you're following instead. And look, this just isn't just about the big things. See, when we have these big decisions to make, it's real easy to lean and cling to the Lord. It was in the mundane that Gideon began to slip. It was in the smaller things. He had done the biggest thing, 300 soldiers against thousands. That was huge. So who did he have to cling to? But when it felt easy, he started to rely on himself. So I think the first thing we have to do is audit. Who am I listening to? What voices are loudest in my life right now? Second, we have to slow down. Judges 8:4 told us, it says, exhausted but still pursuing. And that sounds noble. But if God hasn't told you to keep going, why are we still running? He never asked, hey, God, we good? Just keep going. Just do more. Just push harder. We often think of listening to God as a technique, reading the Bible, praying. And it is a skill that we build. But if we don't slow down intentionally, life will force us to crash eventually. We will be forced to develop those skills. We'll be forced to cling to the Lord. And any of you have ever been forced? I have. See, activity is not the same as obedience. Just because it's fast doesn't mean it's faithful. And sometimes we have to say, God, I trust that your will is better than my momentum. I trust that clarity is more important than speed. Ask yourself, what am I rushing that needs more prayer? What am I afraid will fall apart if I slow down? Am I running toward God or just away from discomfort? And again, this is about everyday life. Lord, where do you want me to go? Who do you want me to see? Somebody asks you to do something. Lord, do you want me to do it? Gideon couldn't move without God's direction when it felt big. But the easier the decisions got, the more he thought he could be the one to make them. And then third, we have to rebuild the altar. Return to the rhythms and practices that remind you of who God is and who you are. When Gideon first hears from God, he builds an altar and calls it, the Lord is peace. This is not just a symbolic thing. This is a posture. This is a way of saying, Lord, this is about you, not me. He roots himself in worship and remembrance. But in Judges 8, and we'll talk about this as we get towards the end, he builds a monument to himself. So how do we rebuild the altar in our life? We open up the Bible, not just for information, and we say, Lord, what do you want to teach me today? What does this passage have to say to my life? Maybe we keep a journal where you name moments you sense God's leading, correction, or comfort. Maybe you establish a sacred space in your home, a chair, a time of day, a place where you go, and this is the place I just rest in the Lord and say, God, this is about you and me. You speak. This is the place of peace. Not because that place is magical, but because this is the place I dedicate myself to you, Lord. Because I don't make it unless I understand how good and great you are. See, the fall of Gideon didn't begin with rebellion. It begins when the altar got replaced with ambition. We can't just do things for God. We have to be with Him. Listen to Him. Because He is still speaking. And He wants you to hear what He has to say. So here's the second thing we see that goes wrong in Gideon's life. Gideon started protecting himself instead of honoring God. See, there's a moment in the story where something changes. Not in Gideon's circumstances, but in his posture, in the way he comes to the Lord. He's still pursuing the enemy. He's still winning battles. He's still wearing the appearance of a God's servant. But the way he moves begins to shift. See, the fear that once made him cautious has now made him defensive. The humility that once made him dependent has now turned into a need for control. He's not walking by faith anymore. He's bracing for betrayal. See, if you look at Judges 8, 5 through 9, when the men of Succoth come to him, look what happens. So he's being challenged again. And look how he handles it this time. So he said to the men of Succoth, please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing after Zebah and Zalmunna, the king of Midian. And the officials of Succoth said, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your army? So Gideon said, well then, when the Lord is giving them over into my hand, I will flail your flesh with thorns of the wilderness and with briars. And from there he went up to Penuel and spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Succoth had answered. And he said to the men of Penuel, when I come again in peace, I will break down the tower. Now again, you may say, was this wrong for him to speak so harshly to them? Well, where my challenge here is he's deciding who to hold accountable and who to be very respectful to based on who he's speaking to. So the first group of people he speaks to, remember when he flatters them? This is people he respects. This is they are formidable. So what does he do? He doesn't want them on his bad side. And I don't know if God wanted him to be kind or if God wanted to hold them accountable. I have no idea, but neither does Gideon. Because he didn't ask. And so he sets this really high bar that, hey, okay, fine. You'll pay the price when I get back. So look what happens. 14 through 17. And he captured a young man of Succoth and questioned him, and he wrote down for him the officials and elders of Succoth, 77 men. And he came to the men of Succoth and said, behold, Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me, saying, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your men who are exhausted? And he took the elders of the city, and he took thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them taught the men of Succoth a lesson. And he broke down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. So, if we want to give him one credit, he's a man of his word. He does exactly what he said he would do. And he destroys them all. But not because God told him to. Not because God was offended. Often we see when God tells people to destroy somewhere, it's what? To protect the name of the Lord. To honor God. Who did they offend? Did they offend God or did they offend Gideon? And so what we see is it's not because God told him to do it, it's because his pride was wounded. And see, this isn't the obedience of someone honoring God. This is the retaliation of someone protecting their ego. And this is the shift we see here. Gideon stopped living from trust and started leading from fear. And it's easy to miss this because he still looks strong. And it still looks spiritual. But it's not surrender, it's survival. But before we get too harsh on Gideon, this same thing can happen to us. I don't know many people that wake up one day and say, I'm not going to trust God today. I can tell you, I don't think ever once I verbally or even mentally acknowledged that I wasn't going to trust God. But I can admit that there have been plenty of times that I didn't trust God. It usually doesn't happen like that. No, what happens is we just get tired. We get tired of being misunderstood. We get tired of waiting. We get tired of risking our hearts. And so we start protecting what matters to us, our comforts, our image, our role, our peace. And we still serve, we still show up, we say all the right things, but our decisions are no longer a response of worship, but it's about us. It's about how we feel. It's about what we do. And that's where Gideon ended up. And if we're not careful, we'll end up there too. So I have a question for you before we move out of this point. Are you a thermostat or a thermometer? See, a thermostat sets the temperature in the room. A thermometer only reflects it. One leads, the other reacts. When Gideon trusted God, he was a thermostat, bringing courage into fearful places, calming his doubts with God's voice, setting a spiritual tone that others could follow. Others became more faithful because of his faith. But by Judges 8, something changes. He starts reacting to the people around him. When his tribe questions him, he flatters them. When strangers resist him, he threatens them. When the battle ends, instead of building an altar, he builds a monument to his success. He stopped setting the tone and he let people set it for him. And when we look in our lives, when we stop listening to God and start reacting to people, we become thermometers. We're joyful until someone disappoints us. We're faithful until someone criticizes us. We're generous until no one thanks us. We're obedient until we feel ignored. And when we do that, we're no longer acting from trust, but we're reacting from insecurity. So the question we have to ask today is, what are you letting set the temperature in your life? What has the most influence over your spiritual temperature right now? Is it the Holy Spirit? Or is it coworkers, your reputation, your wounds? Are you consistent in your love and obedience, or are they only as steady as your last affirmation? See, the danger of being a spiritual thermometer is your peace becomes circumstantial, your joy becomes conditional, and your obedience becomes fragile. So when you walk into a room, your home, your workplace, your church, are you setting the temperature by listening to God, or are you mirroring the mood of those around you, of the circumstances in your life? And see, ultimately, the difference between thermostats and thermometers, spiritually, is your fear and respect you have of the Lord. How much you'll either set the temperature or the temperature will be set for you is dependent on how much fear and respect you have for God. Oswald Chambers said this: the remarkable thing about fearing God is when you fear God, you fear nothing else. When the fear of God is your foundation, it puts every other fear in its place. But when you lose that fear, all the other fears around you rush in to take its place. And all of a sudden, you went by being led by the Spirit to by being dictated and determined by everything and everyone around you. Gideon went from a thermostat, setting the temperature. Not because he was great, but because God set his temperature, and so he impacted everywhere he went. And here's the great thing about a thermostat. The temperature set on a thermostat doesn't change even if the temperature in the room changes. If I set that on 72 or 80 or whatever I set it on, it can be a blazing fire in here. And it doesn't mean that'll cool it down. But what it does mean is it won't change it. But a thermometer is only as cool as the room it's in. And it gets just as hot as the room it's in. So spiritually, are you a thermostat or a thermometer? Let's continue. The last thing we see is Gideon made it all about himself. By Judges 8, Gideon is no longer the man hiding in the winepress, pleading for assurance from God. He's tasted victory and leadership, and this dangerous shift begins to happen. See, we see in Judges 8, 1 through 3, Ephraim confronts Gideon for not including them in the battle, and he begins to manage perception. He doesn't ever ask God, what should I do? He just responds to his instinct. Then 5 through 9, we see they come, he gets upset, and he seeks vengeance. And then we get to verse 24 through 27. And here's what it says. It says, then Gideon said to them, this is his people, it says, let me make a request of you. Every one of you give me the earrings from this spoil. For they had golden earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And they answered, we will willingly give them. And they spread a cloak, and every man threw it in the earnings of his spoil. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, and besides the collars that were around the necks of their camels. And Gideon made an ephod of it and put it in his city. And all Israel whored after it there. And it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. See, you may have tried to say, how do we know what he was doing was wrong? Because there was a little bit of question there, right? But now we're here and there's no denying. Gideon was headed in the wrong direction fast. And all of a sudden, he had this bright idea. Hey, let me have all your gold so we can make a monument to me. And see, this is what is heartbreaking. The very people he once led into battle now follow him into idolatry. He didn't set out to make it about himself. But somewhere along the way, the line between God's glory and Gideon's identity blurred. He didn't announce he was shifting. He never said, hey, by the way, Today's the day I stop making it about God and we start making it about Gideon. He never says that. Honestly, I don't think he realized he was doing it. But it doesn't mean it didn't happen. And all of a sudden, it became about what he did, what he said, what he was capable of. But what I want you to understand is this trap is for all of us. Not just leaders, not just pastors, not just people in prominent positions. It's for parents, students, volunteers, spouses, anyone who attaches their identity to being right, needed, or validated. And I know that's none of you. But if we're honest, it's easy for all of us to do. So how, and we'll wrap up with this, how do we know we've made it all about us? Here's 4 things that help us see if we've made it about us. Here's number 1. We get easily offended. Proverbs 19:11 says, good sense makes one slow to anger, and it's his glory to overlook an offense. The thinner your skin, the more you reveal where your identity is anchored. And I have told anyone in my life that'll listen, anyone who says, how do we help you? How do we pray for you? I'll say, keep an eye out for me. When I get extra critical, when I get extra snippy, you can almost guarantee I'm not leaning on and depending on the Lord the way I was. It's an instant warning sign for me that I have started to depend more on me than depend on God. When I get critical, when I get criticizing. See, the more easily you're hurt, the more what it helps to reveal is the more dependent you are on others to hold yourself and your self-esteem and your value. So here's what it looks like. Small comment cuts deep. Someone forgets to say thank you and it gnaws at you for days. A suggestion for improvement feels like an attack on your worth. I heard this said once, offense becomes a mirror. If you're always hurt, it might be because your sense of identity is dependent on the reaction of others, not rooted in the approval of God. When you are the center, everyone's words orbit around your worth. And so you become dependent on what others say and think and feel. And take it from me, it's not a fun place to be. Here's another sign that it's become all about you. We start keeping score. You begin to mentally track what you've done, what others haven't, and where you've been overlooked. Resentment grows. And we start building these quiet narratives. They always overlook me. I'm the only one who steps up or does anything. People just use me. See, grace doesn't keep score. Love gives freely. Keeping a tally reveals that you are not just doing good, you're building a case. And you may say, so what? I'm supposed to let people take advantage of me? No. What you're supposed to do is go, Lord, why am I doing this? And when we realize we're doing it so we can feel valuable, we say, God, take that from me. Because if you do anything to feel your value and worth, you just as easily as you feel valuable and worthy, you will feel like garbage. If who you are is dependent on anyone other than the Lord, expect a wild roller coaster of emotions. Third, another sign is that we feel entitled to control or credit. See, Gideon demanded honor and submission and later built a golden ephod that became a symbol of self-glory. See, control and credit are subtle idols. If you need them to feel okay, then your soul isn't trusting God to define or defend you. How does this look? You feel like things will fall apart if you're not in charge. You step into leadership but get frustrated when you're not thanked or noticed. You want decisions to go your way, not just because it's best, but because it makes you feel secure. And I'll just encourage you here, because you may go, well, what if my way is best? Let me tell you this. This is a good, quick way to know if you've made it all about you. If it's not, if you see a situation and you can't consider a possibility where someone might be right other than you, you've made it all about you. It's not to say you're wrong, but if someone else can't be right, if another way can't work, you've probably made it all about you. Last, we confuse attention with identity. See, Gideon says it's not about him, but he keeps acting like it. This is the subtle trap. Attention feels like healing when you're insecure. You don't have to feel good about yourself to make it all about you, because you may say, I don't like myself. Well, guess what? We can just as easily make it all about us, even if we don't like us. See, insecurity is still self-obsession, just wearing different clothes. Some people dominate conversation because they're proud. Others do it because they're terrified of being unseen. Some refuse to serve because they think they're too important. Others refuse because they think they're too broken. Either way, the focus is the same. You. See, shame says, I'm the exception to grace. But the cross says, no, you're the reason for it. Gideon's story is a cautionary tale, but not just of pride, but of insecurity, left unchecked. He didn't start arrogant. He started in need and then forgot he still was in need. And once the mission became about him, even small slights, threats, began to impact his ego. Let me ask you this. Think of for just, and this came to me this morning, and we'll wrap up. Think of for just a second a time in your life where you were desperate for God, where you needed God so much you couldn't move, you couldn't take one direction unless He told you, because you were desperate for Him. You got it? Well, here's the truth. Today, you need Him that much. You don't need Him any less today than you did the time you thought you were desperate. And that's where Gideon messed up. He thought there was a difference between his most desperate time and any other moment in his life. So when we look at Gideon's story, as we wrap up, we've seen his whole story now, 6, 7, and 8. We see that his life started in fear, but it was faith in God's voice that moved him forward. He listened, he obeyed, he tore down idols, and he trusted God against all odds, even the most impossible odds. And when that battle was over and peace came to Israel, then we get to Judges 8, and something's missing. We said it. There's no prayer. There's no altar. There's no guidance. There's no gratitude. And God gets quiet, and Gideon doesn't notice. Because Gideon stopped listening, he started protecting himself, and eventually he made it all about himself. And by the end of his life, and this is what's heartbreaking, Gideon may have looked successful, but spiritually he was hollow. And look at what Gideon had left behind in the end. Because we only remember the big parts of his story. But what he leaves behind is an idol, a fractured nation, and a son named Abimelech, which means my father is king. If you didn't think he was making it all about himself, he named his son, hey, my daddy's king. And this son would go on to murder his brothers to take the throne. This was his legacy. And I know we may not lead armies and we may not build idols, but we still all face the same dangers. We face the danger of drifting from God's voice. We face the danger of leading from fear instead of trust. And we face the danger of making life all about how we look, what we get, or how we feel. So today, maybe it's time to go to the Lord and say, God, I've been leading without listening, and I'm sorry. God, I've been reacting instead of surrendering. Forgive me. God, I've made it about me, and I want to make it about you again. See, you don't need to be impressive or have it all figured out. You just need to start listening again. And begin to come back to the one who called you, the one who saw you, the one who chose you when you had nothing to offer, when you had done nothing, at your lowest, and come back to him. To make it about him again. Because when he is at the center, that is when we are who he called us to be. As I thought about it this morning, when I think about my freest, when I think about it my most joyful, when I think about my life, when it's the most fulfilling, was not when I was in control, not when I was creating and planning, not when I was solving the problems, when I was on my knees, surrendered to the Lord. And you may sometimes wonder, because I've asked this question, Lord, why does it seem like my life is only full of things that bring me to my knees? And I think it's because unless it's hard, I don't get on my knees. Gideon began to think that there was something different about his life when he was in the winepress and when he was victorious. But the man in the winepress and the man that was victorious was no more or less in need. So I ask you today as you leave to take that memory of the version of you that was at your most in need and ask God to remind you that that's who you are today, right now. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for who you are. I thank you for Gideon's story. I pray that we will learn from it, that we don't have to get so far away, that we don't have to once be used to do great things and then leave a legacy of shame and guilt, and to the point where just the name of our own child glorifies ourselves. Lord, I pray that we'll use his life and his examples to examine and reflect our own life. Convict us, challenge us, bring us back to you. Lord, when you get quiet, I pray we'll stop. When we can't hear you, we'll get still and we'll wait until you speak again. I love you, Lord, and I thank you for who you are. In Jesus' name, amen.